Welcome to the Kawartha Small Business Podcast, where we believe the Kawarthas can be the most thriving region in Canada for small business. I'm Brian Rump from Profit Coach.
And I'm Matt Garrity of Matty G Digital.
And before we get started, head over to kawarthasmallbusinesspodcast.ca/checklist and download Matt and Brian's marketing checklist for Kawartha small businesses. Today we are recording from the Thrive Podcast Studio / Media Room at Thrive Co-working Community at 18 Kent Street West in downtown Lindsay. And our topic today is those pesky kids these days / this economy. Kind of two separate but related topics. And really these are, I think, common phrases that we thought would be fun to dig into, because people are always talking about the kids these days, just as much as they're always talking about, this economy.
Kids these days in their podcasts. I was going to say, we need to be careful that we don't offend anybody, but I can't imagine there's any boomers listening to this podcast.
There might be. We've had some boomers reach out.
Are you a boomer?
I'm not a boomer.
I've never seen you look so offended.
I think when I was younger, I probably would have been like, yeah, I'm an old man. Because I think I've been 40 years old for 30 years now. And I feel younger now than I ever have in my entire life.
Okay, boomer.
Yeah. But yeah, those kids these days are like, this economy has got, because I've heard people and adults talk about that forever. No one's ever like, man, the economy is just so amazing right now and everything's easy and great. They always are like, well, you can't predict whatever in this economy. And I just think that's an interesting way to look at things.
It's almost like a buzzword that's existed forever, because I bet you in my lifetime, every single year, at least one person has said that, probably more. Always. I remember years ago, before we are in this economy with just inflation,
yeah,
the people would constantly just be saying, oh, this economy. 2008 or whatever, when like things got maybe tough, like financially, for like with the recession, for you probably know better, the amount of quarters we went through, that was maybe a this economy type of situation. But I don't know what that even means. What does that mean to most people? I have no idea what this economy means.
It's what I like about it is when you dig into it, you really realize like different big indicators, different industry trends, they affect different people differently and at different life stages. So, for me, like 2008 was interesting. It wasn't as bad in Canada as it was in the U.S., but in Canada, we love pretending that we're Americans more than we like saying that we're not Americans. We're different. But certain sectors were hit hard. GM pretty much started closing down. The auto sector slowed down. I remember my dad at the time was working for a plant that did stuff in the auto parts realm.
Yeah.
Was like laid off for long periods of time. He had just bought a new car, and then the same vehicle like 6 months later was like $8,000 cheaper. They couldn't get rid of them, which was like kind of funny, and that impacted him more than any recession he could remember, because they were comparing it to like a recession from like the early 80s, and he was like, I don't remember. And partly it's like you don't always remember it, or like unless it really impacted you, things always have a way of turning out, being different. Other people, it doesn't even impact them at all. It's like you didn't lose your job. Nothing you touch has been negatively impacted. In some cases, things improved for you, but you love to pile on the sort of, this economy, or, the governments are always like, well, once we get the economy going again, and it's like, well, it is going. It's always changing.
Yeah. And like the stuff that we're dealing with now out of COVID a little bit, when groceries are more expensive, but realistically, like how much more are you really spending every week on groceries? The gas is something that's pretty serious. This is going to piss a lot of people off, but yeah, I get a lot of stuff on Facebook where you're seeing people complain about gas and how much it costs to fill up their truck. And like, whoa, woe is me with my big truck. And I'm like, dude, you're a mortgage broker. You don't need a truck.
Oh, yeah.
Or you're driving to your retail job. You don't need a truck. You can make a sacrifice, or you can do things in your life to make that burden of gas in your truck a heck of a lot easier for you.
Yeah, I kind of like it. And this is, it gets back to people's choices. People do interesting and strange things. They'll blame the economy because it's like, well, money's tight for me this week, but they're still buying stuff on credit cards. They're still like, leveraging themselves to buy like a second property because that's like a trend. And I think, we don't all inherently deserve all sorts of easy wealth and all of these things. So it's not always the economy, it's your decisions to like overstretch yourself or buy a $90,000 truck when a $40,000 SUV would do, right? And I do think it's funny when people are like, well, can't go to the cottage this weekend. My $80,000 truck, I'm not going to drive to my $1 million cottage because it's going to cost me an extra $25 in gas to get there. And I laugh about that, but there are most people totally overspend. So their disposable income is so small. So sometimes it's like, well, I got my $1,000 a month truck payment and my $2,000 a month mortgage and my $2,000 a month cottage mortgage and all those expenses. And I make good money, but then I have like $50 left over for gas every week. So when it moves up a little bit, it is like something that doesn't impact them, but the impact's fairly small.
Oh, for sure. Remember a couple of weeks ago, or it was, I guess, a month ago now, where people were losing their minds that they suspected that the government was going to put like a $1,000 to maybe $4,000. No, I think it was $1,000 to $3,000 tax, maybe yearly, maybe a purchase on their trucks.
Oh,
and that's not like even confirmed. It
no,
was
that
just
was right wing policy analysts who kind of read things and infer from it, and it's kind of a scaremongering sort of political exercise.
And like that's less than 1% of what your truck would have cost.
Yeah.
And honestly, if you're spending, how much is a truck now? $60,000 new, 70, 80, 90.
It's crazy. Like we live on a farm, and my wife like does a lot of driving her vehicle in fields, which is crazy. So we would like to have a small pickup truck. You can't really find them small, and there's not like a inexpensive one, but like the small ones are like $45,000, like a small basic truck now, and like then they jump up from there to like in the 60s, 70s, like $80,000. Like I just think it's insane.
Another $1,000 on $45,000 isn't a big issue. Yeah. If that's a big issue, you really should be concerned about some other things going on in your life.
The other neat thing about that, and it's almost like when people complain about like carbon tax as well. Taxes are incentives to like control behavior. So it's like that's the point of carbon taxes. It makes it more expensive, and it's incentivizing you to not use as much, right? So yes, you have an $80,000 truck that you never use for any purposes that you could be driving like a moped around for, like somewhere in between is something reasonable for you. And that's kind of a macro issue, but the point is it's, people are always complaining about the state of the economy. There are some changes that I think that go up and down. There are industry trends, but usually we kind of forget about it. And even within that, there's always opportunities somewhere.
Where did all this inflation? Sorry, I'm going way off track now.
Yeah.
Like, I don't understand anything about anything, which is clear. But like, why is this inflation so high of late because of COVID? Or is it after COVID? I mean, is it because of like people are having issues with delivering products and services, or like A, producing them, and then B, like logistically getting them to people?
So I'll try to, like, I don't know for sure. I'm not a real economist.
You can just read about it on Facebook and figure it out.
I don't listen to certain things, but I can give you the macroeconomics, sort of what economics 101 aspect. One is there's different, everything's always like multi-causal. So there's supply chain issues. There's humans are involved as well. So sometimes when everyone's like, oh, inflation, people just raise their prices a bit. Oh, everyone's expecting inflation, so we'll put in some inflation. So there's a little bit of that. One of the macro ones is the Bank of Canada, in theory, exists to control inflation. Their target inflation is 1% to 3%. So their target's 2% plus or minus 1%. How they control that is interest rates. For a long time, they did not raise interest rates like they should have. And what happens is when you don't do that, inflation goes high. They, in COVID, were at a time where they should have started raising. They didn't. They started doing some other macroeconomic things to try to keep stability. But then humans just went insane and started like upbidding houses like crazy. Yeah. And then there's some follow along for that too. If you buy $1 million house and you're going to renovate your kitchen, which is say 20% of your house, guess what a kitchen renovation is going to somehow magically cost, right? They're not going to keep it low. So people start piling on, kind of, but interest rates, in a vacuum, again, there's all sorts of things, inflation starts creeping up. Then you would increase interest rates, make the cost of borrowing higher. It cools things down. They kind of got away from doing that. There's maybe some politics about it, or just screwing up. Or I follow somebody who analyzes financial data for a living. He's like, they just were ignoring their own numbers in some cases. So we're now seeing some big jumps in interest rates, and people are losing their minds, even though it's not a surprise. But if you overextended to buy a big expensive house on a 1% rate, but that rate goes to 2%, you've now doubled your interest cost. And there's just a spin-off effect of, some of those things. But, the core reason is interest rates are too low. And what they do is they become artificially low. And then it's almost like giving away money. So then inflation just happens. And I don't have all the technical words right, but what's ridiculous about it is inflation is really a tax on the lower and middle classes. And one of the schools of that people have looked at is like, oh, Canadians saved a bunch of money during the pandemic, so now inflation's a way to like get that away from people. So it's just we can get into like who the world was really for, sort of the rich elites in some ways, and not moving on, and it isn't really for everyday people. But we end up in periods of extra inflation. I think when you look at groceries and stuff, for a long time, we get used to having certain things, liking certain things. And then when there's a shock in like supply chains or trends change, like inflation, like the prices just go up. And then people don't stop buying it. So people just keep putting their prices up.
So I guess to summarize, you're saying that it's exclusively the fault of Trudeau and the Liberal government.
That's funny. No, it's not really at all. So
that's not what Facebook tells me, Brian.
I know Facebook loves to say that. I really get angry with like the political parts of that, because the Bank of Canada, in theory, is
independent, right?
Yeah, it's independent. It's not up to the sitting party of the day, but it's also a hot button topic. So when you're in opposition, you just want to blame everything on the other person, even if it has nothing to do with what they're doing. They could be doing maybe some things. I think the Bank of Canada has dropped the ball on stuff. Firing everybody isn't necessarily the solution to that. They're trying to balance a lot of things. It's also, it's fascinating too, because you look at, like, I'm a millennial, sort of an early mid, like Xennial, Gen X, and I've been through like the dot-com bubble bursting, the financial crisis, some things a bit before COVID were downturning, and we have COVID. So you go through all these shocks. So like, I haven't been able to build crazy wealth like some boomers have been able to over their time. If you're a boomer and own real estate, like the last few years, that's skyrocketed up, and it's a little bit, say, unofficial. So if you're a boomer, your house has gone up a lot in price. The government intervenes to make things easier for, say, my generation. You don't want to lose wealth either. I think it's really funny when boomers hate Trudeau, but I'm like, your government and like policies have inflated your wealth like crazy the last few years. Like, how could you possibly be mad at the government for that? I tell my parents that kind of all the time. They don't. It's uncomfortable for them, but it's the reality. And then that's where like the political stuff comes in place. Mm-hmm. And then you don't want to crash that market, because there also so much happens in the economy because of consumer confidence. So some people, nothing changes for their situation, but they feel optimistic. So, they buy the $80,000 truck, even though they can't actually afford it. And they're like, oh, well, I can make it next month, so I buy it. I'm confident. And then other times, maybe they have some money, but they're like, oh, things aren't looking good, so I'm going to pull back on my spending, and they delay purchases. So it's fascinating to talk about that stuff. And what I think is neat is, and to sort of wrap it back to what does this economy even mean? Often people think it's like bad, right? But they're still spending.
Sure.
Or even things like, real estate goes up, and I worked years and years in the bank, and I watched people refinance, spend, and refinance. So when your house price goes up more than inflation, some people see that almost as free money. Mm-hmm. And then they're used to debt. They just keep borrowing more and spending it, and they're buying vacations, and they're doing really fancy renovations, which then creates an industry for the tradespeople. Even like trades jobs over the last 15 years been more in demand, higher paying. Like, all of these things are partially because of inflating real estate prices, because people now feel like, oh, I bought a house for $200,000. It's worth $1 million now. I can get a homeowner's line of credit for $400,000, and I can renovate it, get a pool, I can go on vacations, I can buy the truck, I can spend all this money. And as long as they have the optimism of like still having a paycheck coming in, being able to service that debt, all's good. But if you then start swinging the other way, where people aren't as optimistic about their jobs, or that house is now worth $800,000 instead of $1 million, then they start panicking and cancel stuff, and there's a bad spin-off effect. So when you have that sort of like didn't raise interest rates at the right time, and now you're out of balance, it's really hard to then get things back into balance. But through it all, I think as a small business, there's always still people doing stuff. So you just have to build better businesses and find and adapt to it.
Yeah, there's always people opening businesses. There's always people trying to grow their business. There's always people, like you said, spending, putting in pools, putting in renovations, buying bigger vehicles. It doesn't stop those people from ever complaining about the economy.
Yeah, they don't talk about it, but it's what people say versus what they do, which I think is fascinating. And the other, to wrap up the economy portion is there's no economic profit in the long run. So you'll see a lot of industries that go up and down. Anytime things feel easy, there's going to be a change, right? So it's like sometimes you're in a boom in an area where everyone has great jobs and wages are super high. Everyone's buying and spending like crazy. That's going to create either more competition. It's going to incentivize people to enter in that, start competing on price, and sort of bring it sort of back down to some sort of equilibrium. And that just has always happened. I love, when you look at history, there's always people writing the same articles, in papers since papers began, right? Everything's terrible. It's never going to be good again. But we just keep overall getting better.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wonder when it started, the first person to just roll their eyes and say, oh, in this economy.
Oh, it's probably time immemorial, right? When they invented the word economy or market or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Things have always changed. Businesses have always been around. There's always been small businesses, merchants, that stuff just happens. So yeah, we sort of milk the economy. So let's rant about the kids these days. I hear they're lazy and no one even wants to work anymore.
Millennials, right? The funniest thing about people complaining about millennials is I'm a millennial, right? I'm 34 years old.
Millennials are approaching early 40s now, 40s, 30s. The actual, the kids these days are a whole different generation than the millennials.
Are they Gen X or Z?
Gen Z. Yeah.
Gen Z. Yeah.
Yeah. X is before the millennials.
Oh.
So they're calling them Gen Zs, I think. And it's just, it's interesting to hear some of those things. I think it's another time in memoriam, thing to talk about.
And you experience it as a teacher. Do you find that there has been a difference in the people that you're teaching now versus when you started?
Oh, my view is kids are more creative. They, in some ways, work way harder. It's different. I think we're always adapting, and I think maybe for a long time we haven't adapted in terms of what the system is and what we're training. So yeah, kids aren't doing some of the things that maybe happened years ago, but I don't believe for a second that people aren't as hardworking or aren't as smart as they used to be. I think with more information, people are more reluctant to be exploited in some cases. But teaching at college, almost all of the kids have one or two jobs and go to college, it's ridiculous. We're training people to burn out too early. So yeah, they don't do as good maybe in certain classes, but that's because they don't have the capacity to do it. I don't believe anyone's just not doing stuff because they're lazy.
Kids these days need two jobs because of this economy.
Yeah, and there is some lifestyle creep. And it's when I was a kid, I didn't have an iPhone. I didn't have, there's things I could list, but they didn't exist. But nowadays, it's part of society. You're connected. It's how people do business and connect. So it is kind of evolved to be a need.
It is. It's like it's like you go outside and you put on your pants and you put on shoes and you bring your phone. Like, I don't think that's outrageous, and I'm sure it'll be the boomers. Or I'm sorry if I'm labeling or judging boomer. I'm going to just use that as the term, but it's those people that are going to complain about it, and it's just you wonder why. Like, it just doesn't make any sense. Like, we all had these things, and maybe we didn't grow up with them. Yeah. But like, these things become staples and important things in our lives. And those boomers are the same ones that are out in their truck and they're going to their fancy office jobs that they don't need to, right? Like, everyone makes these ridiculous decisions, and honestly, it's probably jealousy. And a younger generation, they've got things. It's never easier, but it is easier though. Like, because like things change, things evolve, and like, I want that, and I don't understand when people don't want that.
And people, like, we've always wanted better for our kids. And I think in some ways, like, I don't know if that stopped or people just are jealous of it. You know, the boomer generation is like the most spoiled generation, like, ever, in terms of rapid changes and rapid abundance, especially, you know, I guess I could speak more to North America for that. You know, North America, Canada, the US, were really the only ones that had the baby boom post-war, because they, you know, the war wasn't where they were. They won, came home, you know, economy was fired up because they were supplying, you know, to rebuild Europe and all these places. And there's a million impacts. There's new invention and innovation, but, you know, they're the generation that might have been born like my parents didn't have indoor plumbing when they were born, and children, they didn't have refrigerators. Like, you know, some of them maybe did, but within their lifetime, they've grown all of these conveniences kind of fairly quickly. And usually people, you know, they want those better lives for their kids. But what I think is neat is there's articles from that time about, you know, kids these days, they just don't want to work like the same way, right? Or when I was a kid, we worked in the factories 7 days a week, and, you know, this new generation is not that great. And, you know, if you look at from, let's say, a military perspective, almost the beginning of every war, there's like articles about, you know, how can we have an army? Like, because these kids can't do it, right? But then now we look back at like the veterans and it's like, oh, they were tough and all of these sort of attributes. But it's just all the story we tell, I think.
Yeah, I think that drives me crazy when people complain about, not so much kids, but just in general, like, how things are so much better back then. And I always I sort of started challenging people a bit on it.
Yeah.
Like, I want to know, what exactly do you mean? Like, what part was better? And you'll have like some people like, well, it was safer back then, where kids could just go outside all day and you wouldn't have to see them. I'm like, I don't think that that's true. I don't think that it's become any more or less safe. I think now we're just way more aware as to what is going on in the world. We have technology where we're staying up to date on news. We're seeing it on TV faster. We're not waiting for the paper. We're seeing it on our phones instantly. I don't think that people have become more malicious or violent or criminal in the last 30, 40 years. We just have so much more information.
Yeah, in many ways, I think it's a lot less. Right, I think kids are probably more safer now, but they, you know, parents maybe care about their kids more or have time to go out with them, or if things happened before, they just wouldn't talk about them. Or like even say bullying on the playground, that used to just be an expected thing. You know, now
builds character.
All the parents are standing around drinking coffee, watching the kids play. It's just a different cultural thing, and they're not out there because it's dangerous. They're just out there because they enjoy being around their kids more. It's just different. But I think, you know, from a business perspective, you hear, you know, kids these days, but I think people don't want to be exploited. They are working. I know my wife teaches at a high school, and one of the things that bothers her is how much a lot of the kids are working. Like they're working almost full-time jobs, and they're making decent wages. And the ones who really work hard have all these people who want to hire them. And that's probably holding them back in the end because they're not spending as much time on things they're studying or learning, which is probably dangerous. Like they're just working too hard, if anything, and too many expectations. We also have so much information to absorb that I think, if anything, and you see this with some maturity, like 25 is the new 18 because it just takes you longer to like maybe develop certain habits. But in general, as a sweeping thing, like I don't think kids these days are at all lazier.
Actually, and this is like maybe anecdotal or just thinking about some stuff in my head a little bit, the people that I see or hear complaining about kids these days the most and complaining about how things were so much better back then and look how things have become, they're the most misogynistic, sometimes racist people that I know. Yeah, they say the most offensive, stupid, idiotic things. And they're the ones that just think that, yeah, I don't know.
Well, I think that's sort of the, they want to exploit kids. They're like, hey, I need a teenager to come in and do these, really good work for me for really cheap. And I think that stuff's going away, right? It's hard to just hire a desperate kid to do it because they, need money to help support their family. And I do think that, again, if you look at trends in things like poverty, there's still a lot of poverty where kids have to work to like buy all their own stuff or contribute to the household. Sure. I look at my grandmother's like age, like she had like 11 siblings and lived in poverty, and like the kids were basically had to work and like give money to the family to like make sure everyone survived.
Yeah.
And I think we're not in that phase, so kids don't have to do that. But it's not that they just worked harder back then.
And people like losing their mind about $15 minimum wage or whatever it is now. I think maybe it's a bit more, or maybe it's 15. But like things are more expensive now. Homes aren't $100,000 in Kawartha Lakes. A loaf of bread isn't 25 cents. You can't go to the movie for a nickel.
Yeah.
Like things are different, bro. Like things have changed and it's evolved, and it's inflation and like things that have grown, and like things cost more now. You can't live on $15 an hour.
I love, one of the things I do to wrap us up near the end is I will do things as a product of minimum wage. So people will do like here's a car ad for $2,500 for a Mustang. I'll look up what the minimum wage was when that ad was out and just do simple math of like how many hours at minimum wage was that car versus things now. And in some cases, things were more expensive then as they are now, but there's more demands on your money, or it wasn't just as cheap, or now it's harder for kids. So as much as it's like, well, we went to the movies for a nickel, and it's like, well, nowadays comparatively that's just a different thing, and it's actually harder, right? You had more then, you had less to spend it on, but it wasn't as bad as it is now because kids maybe have more things to spend it on, and wages aren't actually as good comparatively.
There's more information. There's more competition for dollars too.
Yeah. So it's really, really neat. Any final thoughts on the kids these days or this economy?
I feel like we just keep ranting over and over and over again, so I'll just say no.
I think it's a fun episode. Hopefully people like it. I think the point of this is that it's really a mindset thing, and to wrap it all into small business, I think you got to paddle your own canoe. You got to seize opportunities. You got to innovate, see the positive and stuff. And, this economy or the kids these days aren't an excuse for your business. You got to adapt and work around it. So if you want to talk about this more with your business, we'd love to. We can help you start, grow, or recharge. You can reach out to set that up with us by emailing us at setitup@kawarthasmallbusinesspodcast.ca.